Kelsey. This is my channel, The Fancy Hat Lady Reads. I'm wearing one of my fancy booktube hats, and today I'm going to try to bring you the rest of my March wrap-up. This is specifically going to be the 8 books that I did not get to in the first half of my March wrap-up, which was a much shorter video talking about the 3 books that I read for readathons in the month of March. I will link that video, that part 1 video for you, so you can check it out if you missed it. So the first book I finished in March I had been reading throughout the entire month of February, and that was How to Be a Victorian, A Dawn to Dusk Guide to Victorian Life by Ruth Goodman. This was a buddy read that I did with Maya from Maya Reads and Rachel from Nnedi. I will link both of their channels in case you don't watch them already. You probably should. And a buddy read was exactly what I needed to get through this at all. I was lagging behind our reading schedule by a couple chapters for most of the month, but I don't think I would have ever made it through a nonfiction book this long in even like a month without having something like a buddy read. But this book is basically exactly what it says it is. It is an explanation of basically just day-to-day life in Victorian England. It's sort of structured around a daily schedule, like it starts with getting up, getting dressed, a trip to the privy, personal grooming, goes all the way through like the main business of the day, back at the house, the midday meal, and then on to the evening, and etc, etc. And she uses each of these chapters to talk about a different aspect of Victorian life, switching between, you know, what men would be doing, what women would be doing, what children would be doing, and talking about what people from different social classes and also from different regions of England would be doing. I'm not a writer, but I imagine this is exactly the sort of everyday detail that like one would absolutely lap up if one were planning on writing some fiction set in this time period. It's all of the little details that sort of cumulatively inform a way of life that you wouldn't necessarily think of. There's lots of details about like personal grooming. There's also a lot about the intense hardships of the working classes. There's absolutely horrific like malnutrition, really misinformed information about nutrition, even more misinformed ideas about medicine. I think I commented at one point like, oh my gosh, it's a wonder anyone survived being sick in the Victorian era, given the things people thought were supposed to cure them. But also in a big picture sense, though it really wasn't the focus of the book, I sort of took away a sense that a lot was really happening to modernize the, you know, Western world at this point in history. This is the Industrial Revolution. Like, things were changing really fast, and you can see sort of all of the recognizable aspects of modern life showing up, from deceptive advertising to public transportation, and the rise of all sorts of new regulations to solve various societal problems. The thing that really makes Ruth Goodman's work as a historian stand out here is that she has taken the time to live and experience as much of this stuff firsthand as she can, within, you know, healthy, reasonable limits. She's spent the time wearing the clothes, doing the work, using the homemade hair and skin product recipes, and it's really valuable when she can jump in here and say, I know this sounds bonkers, but it really does work. Trust me, I've done it. So even though I don't read a lot of nonfiction and I find it hard to compel myself to pick it up, I really am glad I read this, and I gave it 4 stars. The next thing I read was a library book, and this is All Systems Red by Martha Wells, the first book in the Murderbot Diaries series. These are Tor.com novellas. So far the first one is the only one that's out, but the second book is coming out soon. This is about a security robot that calls itself Murderbot, who is assigned to a planetary survey team by a company that makes all of their equipment pretty shoddily, including their security robots. And so Murderbot has hacked its governor module, but is keeping that fact a secret. Murderbot is using its autonomy to download and watch a lot of human media, like TV shows, in pretty much every moment of spare time it has. But something starts going really wrong with this survey mission. Nefarious things are happening, and it's up to Murderbot to save the day. So there are definitely, like, wonderful, warm and fuzzy, reluctant hero vibes. But also, I think a lot of nerdy, introvert, bookish people really identify with Murderbot's aversion to spending time with the humans. Murderbot really does not enjoy human interaction. It far prefers fictional humans to real ones. And sort of the most wonderful and awkward thing to watch happen is what happens when this survey team of really genuinely nice people realize that their security robot is, you know, a sentient person and, you know, deserving of respect as a person. And they try to be friendly and Murderbot is like, oh god, no, let me go back to my closet. I think another thing that's really fun about this story is how it sort of challenges assumptions, cultural assumptions about what a rogue AI would do. Two different sets of assumptions. First, there's the sort of understanding that, oh, a rogue AI will go on a killing spree, especially if it's a murder bot, a security robot that is built and programmed for combat. Murderbot, on the other hand, sees no real reason to not just keep doing its job. And then the rather benevolent humans have this other set of assumptions about the sorts of freedoms and the sort of autonomous life that a rogue AI should aspire to, and Murderbot doesn't necessarily identify with that super strongly either. And I think that's the struggle we're going to see Murderbot deal with going on in the series, and I cannot wait. I'm sad that I had to read this book super quickly because it was due back at the library and I didn't realize until the night before. I gave this 4 stars. I wish I'd had a little more time to spend with it. And this was one of the BooktubeSFF Award read-alongs for the month of March. It is a nominee in the short fiction category. Another book I read for a read-along was Akata Witch by Nnedi Okorafor. This is the first book in her young adult series. This book felt really borderline middle grade to me. It felt more middle grade than YA, but I'm assuming the character gets older in the next book, so maybe the series as a whole will be YA. This was a group read for the Into the Forest group on Goodreads that I am a member of. I will link the group down below. And this is about a girl named Sunny who feels like she has a lot of contradictions. She lives in Nigeria. She was born in America to Nigerian parents. So she is Nigerian and American and also albino. And in this book she learns that she is a leopard person, which is basically someone with magical powers. And as a leopard person she is something called a free agent, which means that neither of her parents were leopard people, and so she's introduced to the world of magic not by her family, but by a couple of friends who figure out what she is. And so on top of everything else, she has to start living this double life of being someone with magical responsibilities who also has to keep up a mundane family life at home. What's happening in the plot is that there is a ritual serial killer who's basically killing kids in town, and it turns out that these killings are linked to the magical world, and Sunny and her 2 friends have formed this sort of magical triad that could confront that evil. There were a number of things I really appreciated about this book. The balance between that home life and the magical danger and threat and responsibilities that Sunny faces is a recurring theme in a lot of like YA contemporary fantasy books where, you know, kids still have to go to school and then they also have to save the world. And I often feel like that's handled really poorly, and I didn't feel like it was handled poorly here. Part of the really interesting thing here is that it does take place in Nigeria, and so the aspects of Sunny's home and school life that are cultural or regional are different from what I've read in other books, different from what my life was like growing up. And that part of her life, I think, remains an important part of the book throughout, instead of just eventually getting shoved under the rug as it does in a lot of this sort of fantasy book. On the side of things where all the magical peril is happening, there's also this kind of harsh sense that, well, if you fail and you die, the world goes on without you. You're not that important. Like, she's sort of a bit of a chosen one maybe, but it's hammered home over and over again, like, it isn't all about you. And it's kind of harsh, and I think I would have been a little shocked to read that in a YA book when I was younger, but looking at it now, it's very realistic. The themes of this overall, with Sunny's power and her magic being tied to the parts of her identity that are divided, reminded me a lot of the first two Binti books that I've read by Nnedi Okorafor. This feels essentially like a very different treatment of the same themes. I don't think this book was without flaws, though. The final confrontation was really, really rushed. It started and then it was over and I had no idea what had actually happened. And a couple of people in the Goodreads discussion group commented that there seemed to be some inconsistencies throughout the book in terms of just the timeline of Sunny's backstory and the logistical details. I'll admit I noticed one or two of those as I was reading, and I have a tendency to dismiss that sort of thing as, oh my bad, I probably remembered wrong. But once it was pointed out to me, I was like, oh yeah. Anyhow, that was Akata Witch. I also gave this 4 stars, and I'm looking forward to reading the next book, Akata Warrior. The next book I have to talk about was one that I started on the final evening of the translate-a-thon and fully intended to just read in one sitting, but then I just wasn't feeling it, and it took me several more days to finish the book, and it shouldn't have because this is tiny and a kid's book. And this is Finn Family Moomintroll by Tove Jannson. This is the 3rd book in the classic Finnish children's fantasy series. They are kind of quirky and eccentric with charming illustrations. I've not read the first book, which is very hard to find. The rest of the series is much easier to get your hands on. Each of the stories stand alone, but I get the sense that sort of the introduction of new characters is cumulative from book to book. There were things I didn't understand in book 2 about some of the character relationships, and like, where did this critter come from? And I can see over the course of these 2 books that a few new faces get added to the Moomin family menagerie in every book, because basically the Moomins live in Moomin Valley, and it just seems like everyone they come across like becomes part of the Moomin family. I felt like this had a little bit less of a structured plot than the first one, which might have been why I found it slow going. This basically just follows the Moomins over the course of a summer in Moomin Valley, when a bunch of things happen, although sort of the most important things that seem to happen have to do with the Hobgoblin's hat, and the Hobgoblin, who I am informed is the magician in the original Finnish, which makes a whole ton more sense. I have no idea why it's a hobgoblin. Hobgoblins are not known for magical hats, magicians are. They find the Hobgoblin's hat and don't know what it is, and it starts like transforming things into other things and causing all sorts of mischief. The Hobgoblin is apparently riding around on his panther on the moon looking for a very special ruby. So the plot is all over the place, but this one I think had a little bit more of a strong thematic thread through it than the previous one that I read. This sort of gets at materialism from a lot of different angles, and it's fun to watch over the course of the book. There are some sort of contrasting world views on the ownership of stuff from pre-existing characters. You have like Sniff, who kind of always wants to find things and own them, and gets jealous of other people with better things, shinier things. We have Snufkin, who's sort of a vagabond and doesn't see the point. There's a muskrat who's a philosopher and sort of philosophizes a lot about the meaningless of all the entire material world. There's someone called the Hemulin, who's a collector. And then we get these new characters towards the end called Thingamy and Bob, who are basically adorable little kleptomaniacs. There's a fascinating little trial about who deserves to own a stolen object and why. And it's kind of deep and kind of cool, but it was pretty slow going in terms of the story for me, given that it was such a short book. I gave this 3 stars. The next book I read was another book for the Into the Forest group. This was another library book that's already gone back, and this was Redemption in Indigo by Karen Lord. This starts off as a retelling of a Senegalese folktale. As far as I can tell, the retelling is only the first part of the story though, and then it goes on to be something else. It's about a woman named Pama who has left her gluttonous husband and gone back to her family's home village. Her husband follows her there and some shenanigans ensue, and that's the part that's the retelling as far as I can tell. And then the rest of the story has to do with Pama and these magical spiritual creatures called Jombi. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right. Basically, some of them give her something called a chaos stick, which allows her to manipulate chance and probability in the world, which is this awesome beyond mortal power. And there's one of the Jombi who has lost this power and is after Pama to get it back. And his motives are not good. He's sort of the power-hungry villain, and he has to convince Pama that he deserves to have that power, that he will wield it more wisely than she will. This whole book is written in a very folkloric style. You can tell that everything comes in sets of threes, for example, and it has this sort of rhythm and cadence to it. And it's eventually sort of obvious that it's meant to sound like an oral story being told. And I liked that narrative style a lot. But I found I wasn't really invested in it because it kind of felt a little more like an intellectual exercise in telling a folk tale, or a story based on a folk tale, than it felt like a story that I was really compelled to read. I think that's a really fine line for me sometimes, and this just didn't quite get there for me. Anyhow, I gave it 3 stars, and now I realize I need to backtrack because I missed a book, and that is one that I've already done a series review for, so I'm not going to talk about it all that much here, and that is Taste of Marrow by Sarah Gailey, which is the second book in the River of Teeth duology. I have a series review for this novella duology that I have already posted, so I will link that and you can watch it. Basically, this is an alt history American Western with hippos and a diverse cast of characters. My basic takeaway is that it's very character driven. In this book, the communication and the dialogue that happens between the characters is by far the best part. I don't think Sarah Gailey is as good as writing the action-filled parts of her plot, but the premise is still just fun. So you can go watch my series review where I talk about both this and the first book. Moving on, the next thing I read was an anthology that I read over a course of a couple months or so, and that is The Starlit Wood New Fairy Tales, edited by Dominik Parisien and Navah Wolfe. This was a book I was so excited to read because it has so many authors I'm interested in it, plus a number that I've never heard of before, and because it combines retellings of some more familiar fairy tales with some more obscure ones that were new to me. And yes, contrary to the title, this is an anthology of retellings. These are not new original stories. This also spans a lot of different genres. Reading the introduction, the basic idea is that in traditional fairy tales, the idea of the wood, the starlit wood, represents the unknown. And so when you put the challenge of a retelling to a lot of different authors who write in a lot of different genres and styles, that manifests in different ways. And the unknown and the mystery is part of what I love so much about fairy tales and stories based on fairy tales. So this was a really fascinating anthology for me. I'm just going to read the table of contents to tell you what's in here. The table of contents also says which story each of these is based on. In the Desert Like a Bone by Seanan McGuire is Little Red Riding Hood. Underground by Karen Tidbeck is East of the Sun, West of the Moon. Even the Crumbs Were Delicious by Daryl Gregory is Hansel and Gretel. The Super Ultra Duchess of Fedora Forest by Charlie Jane Anders is The Mouse, the Bird, and the Sausage. Familiars by Genevieve Valentine is The Wolves. Seasons of Glass and Iron by Amal El-Mohtar is The Glass Mountain and The Black Bull of Norway. It's a fusion between the two stories. Bad Girl, The Dead Man and the Wheel of Fortune by Catherine M. Valenti is The Girl with No Hands. Penny for a Match Mister by Garth Nix is The Little Match Girl. Some Weight by Stephen Graham Jones is The Pied Piper of Hamelin. The Thousand Eyes by Jeffrey Ford is The Voice of Death. Giants in the Sky by Max Gladstone is Jack and the Beanstalk. The Briar and the Rose by Marjorie Liu is Sleeping Beauty. The Other Thea by Theodora Goss is The Shadow. When I Lay Frozen by Margot Lanigan is Thumbelina. Pearl by Aliette de Bodard is Da Trang, and the Pearl, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right. The Tale of Mahliya and Mauhub and the White-Footed Gazelle by Sofia Samatar is based on a story of the same title. Reflected by Kat Howard is The Snow Queen, and Spinning Silver by Naomi Novik is Rumpelstiltskin. That is the short story version that is getting a novelization that's coming out soon. I would say there were 3 of these stories that were like obvious 5-star stories for me, because not only were they really, really good, but they were just my sort of thing. And that's the thing with a collection like this. Some of them are going to be more my thing, and some of them are not going to be as much my thing, but I still appreciated most of them a lot. But the ones that were really, really, really my thing were the first story, In a Desert Like a Bone by Seanan McGuire, which stood out for me because it was the first thing of Seanan McGuire's that I've read that I've actually totally loved. It's one of several stories in this book with a Western setting. The writing is just absolutely gorgeous. And I would say it's more of a play on the themes of Little Red Riding Hood than an actual retelling. Another one that was just absolutely my thing through and through was The Other Thea by Theodora Goss, which is based on The Shadow, which is a Hans Christian Andersen story that I've actually never read, even though the themes all seem really familiar to me. This is a contemporary fantasy story about a young woman who has graduated from a magical school and has to go back there to see her old teachers because she's missing something in her life. She's lacking motivation. And it turns out she has to journey into like the fairy otherworld to find and claim back her shadow. The author's note talks about how she was sort of using this story to talk about depression, and it really resonated with me as a story about a young woman trying to find her way in the world. And then the other one that felt just both obviously amazing and obviously my cup of tea was Spinning Silver. This was one of the longest stories in the collection, if not the longest, and it felt like the most sophisticated piece of writing of Naomi Novik's I've ever read. As a take on Rumpelstiltskin, she's latching onto this idea that the Rumpelstiltskin story has a lot in common with like really racist portrayals of Jewish moneylenders in stories like The Merchant of Venice, in how Rumpelstiltskin is basically a story about a heroine who doesn't keep her end of the bargain, doesn't pay back the moneylender, and still manages to get away with it, and the moneylender who didn't get his due is the villain. And so this is a story about a girl who takes over her incompetent father's moneylending business and is really, really good at it. And so she brags when out in the woods that she can turn silver into gold. She means it metaphorically. And there are some magical powers in the forest who take it literally and set some challenges for her. And I am really, really interested to see how this story ends up expanding into a full-length novel. There were also a couple of stories in here that were much less obviously my style of story or of writing, or my genre or subgenre, that nevertheless completely blew me away for various reasons. One of those was The Super Ultra Duchess of Fedora Forest by Charlie Jane Anders, whose short fiction I have not loved in the past, but I was charmed by this. This is a retelling of a super bizarre fairy tale that I have, in fact, read, The Mouse, the Bird, and the Sausage. I remember reading that and thinking, yeah, this is the sort of story that no one, literally no one, could ever get away with writing a retelling of. It just wouldn't work. And of course Charlie Jane Anders would do it, and of course she would be the author who could pull it off. The story is literally about a mouse, a bird, and a sentient sausage who all live together. And to justify this, Anders creates this, like, wacky post-apocalyptic fantasy world where, like, the humans are all gone and the inanimate objects and the animals are, like, all trying to, you know, make their own lives in the absence of the humans. She's put a lot of political commentary into it and given it a revisionist, happier ending. and it's just nuts, and it's nuts that it works, and it works. The other one that took me by surprise was Giants in the Sky by Max Gladstone, which is like far future sci-fi where people long ago uploaded their consciousnesses and became like these godlike post-human beings in space, and Earth has reverted back to like a medieval feudal society, and humans have forgotten that they have a technological past, and most of the godlike post-humans have absolutely no interest in humanity anymore, but our narrator is determined to give them technology and help them through Project Beanstalk to introduce advanced technology to the humans in the guise of fairy tale tropes. And so the Beanstalk is a space elevator, and there are giants in the sky. And this was one of those stories that had like a really steep learning curve in terms of figuring out what the heck was going on. And then once I got it at the end, it made sense and it was wonderful. I would say of all the stories in here, there was only one that I kind of felt was just poorly written, and that surprised me. It was Underground by Karen Tidbeck, which is labeled as East of the Sun, West of the Moon, but in the author's note, it seems like she may have been using a more obscure variant of that fairy tale as the basis. And I felt like the idea of what she wanted to say about this story with this story was there, but the execution was just not. I didn't understand the setting, the reasoning behind which elements were historical, which elements were fantastical, and why, and it just never came together for me. And that surprises me because this is the first thing I've read by Karen Tidbeck, and I've heard so much praise for her writing. I don't know if it means her writing just isn't for me, or if this is just an unusual dud for her. There were a few that were just obviously not my thing because they were trying so hard to be dark and edgy, and that's just not my cup of tea. And I understand that that's totally a personal preference thing. I think The Thousand Eyes was one of those. Some Weight was definitely one of those. That was by Stephen Graham Jones, who I'd never even heard of before, and it's based on the Pied Piper, and that one was an all-out horror story, and I just couldn't, and it was also insanely confusing, and I felt like I wasn't sure if I wasn't getting it just because it was so not my genre. It's about a group of parents whose kids are all disappearing, and it might have something to do with this video game, and they also figure it has something to do with the story of the Pied Piper, and it just gets darker and more twisted, and none of it made sense to me, but it might have made sense to someone else. Bad Girl, The Dead Man and the Wheel of Fortune was one of the grittier ones that I liked a little more. Of course, it's Valenti, and I love her writing, but her short stories don't always do it for me. The Girl with No Hands is about a girl whose father accidentally bargains her away to the devil, but the devil can't take her because she's too pure, so he chops off her hands. And in this version, the devil is a drug dealer, it turns out, and it's all sort of trippy and creepy. Another one that was funnier that had a lot of drugs in it was Even the Crumbs Were Delicious, which is Hansel and Gretel. This is by Daryl Gregory. This is sort of a sci-fi future setting that I think he set some other fiction in, but you don't need to know any of that to read the story. Basically, it's about this guy who is living in this house full of printable drugs because his roommate was a drug dealer, and these two teenage kids break into his house and start eating the stuff, and they start to think that they are living in a fairy tale and that he's a witch. And so the kids think they're in this Hansel and Gretel thing, and he's just like, can I get you safe to your parents? But it turns out that, like in Hansel and Gretel, the parents are terrible, and that's sort of the whole point of the story. When I Lay Frozen by Margot Lanigan was sort of a really straightforward, thumbelina retelling of Thumbelina in some ways, but it made a point of being dark and edgy and disturbing, and that seemed to be sort of the whole point, so I didn't really like it. Another super, super dark one was Familiaris by Genevieve Valentine, which is based on a fairy tale I'm not familiar with called The Wolves, and it has multiple narratives, and it's all about the ways that children destroy and consume their mothers. If you want a story to scare you away from ever wanting kids, that one will do it, but it is excellent excellent. And I think that's just about all the very dark ones. Penny for a Matchmister was also pretty dark, though it has a happier ending than the story it's based on. It's another one of the Western ones, and I think it's set in a world that Garth Nix has set some other short fiction in. Basically, there's some sort of demon-like thing that takes possession of the little match girl in a search for bloody revenge, and the demon, like, has to be exorcised. And I think the ones I haven't talked about yet are the ones I really liked that were my cup of tea. They were definitely my sort of thing. They just didn't, like, knock it out of the ballpark like the 5-star stories. These were like my 4.5-star stories. Seasons of Glass and Iron by Amal El-Mohtar is one of those sort of more standard feminist fairy tale twists that it's a more traditional retelling, and I could read this type of story all day. I actually met Amal El-Mohtar at a book event not long after reading that story, and she signed it for me, and it was lovely. I would say The Briar and the Rose was one of those. I would say Pearl was one of those. That is set in Aliette de Bodard's Julia universe, which is a sci-fi universe focusing on an empire based on Chinese and Vietnamese history. It feels sort of sci-fi of manners-y to me, and I really like that. Reflected by Kat Howard. I pretty much always really like her short fiction. This wasn't as amazing as some of her stories I've read, though, but it is focused on some grad students in a science lab who do some experiments with mirrors that get magical. She's really focusing on the aspect of the Snow Queen that has to do with that shattered mirror. And The Tale of Mahliya and Mauhub and the White-Footed Gazelle by Sofia Samatar is a very meta type of story where a lot of the story is sort of about the story. It feels a little similar to the type of storytelling she used in Selkie's Stories Are for Losers, which I also really liked. I liked it there, I liked it here, it just wasn't one of my standout favorites in this collection. Anyhow, I think I've at least touched on all the stories in here at this point. I know that a few of these are available to read online, so I will link those for you where I can find them. Seasons of Glass and Iron is definitely one. I know the Sofia Samatar story has also been reprinted, and if there are others I can find, I'll post them as well. So I gave this book overall 4 stars. I think what a breakdown of what I thought of each individual story doesn't necessarily communicate is how well I thought this book was put together as a whole. So often when I read anthologies and story collections, I feel like there isn't a flow from story to story, or that the stories altogether don't feel like they're of a piece, or a lot of the time I take issue with the ways the author's notes are presented. This was the rare instance where I felt like all of the author's notes were spot on. They were all each after the story in question. They were all exactly the right length, about yay long, and they all gave me the right sort of information, which is the most important thing. You can tell that the writing prompt for these authors' notes must have been something like briefly describe what drew you to the story that yours is based on, and what compelled you to do this particular take on it. And so as a result, I felt like I got exactly the right information about each of the fairy tales for the ones that I didn't know, that I felt like I understood what the point of the retelling was, which is so important to me with retellings. So I thought this was an excellently edited collection. I really appreciated it, and I found a lot of stories in it that I really loved, and I gave it 4 stars. And then the last thing I read in the month was another one of the BooktubeSFF Award nominees and read-alongs, and that was Nevermoor, The Trials of Morrigan Crow by Jessica Townsend, which is a middle grade novel. This is the first in a series about young Morrigan Crow. She is the daughter of a town mayor, I think, and because she was born on a certain day at the turning of a new age, she's believed to be cursed. She's on a registry of cursed children, and so anything that's bad luck that happens anywhere in her vicinity is legally blamed on her, and her father has to pay a fine. And the other thing about cursed children is that they are all supposed to die on the last night of the age. And so this is predicted to be a year from now when Morrigan is turning 13 maybe, but it happens now when she's like 12 instead because the age ends a year earlier than predicted. I might be a year off in my memory as to her age, but anyways, the end of the age happens, and instead of dying, she gets whisked off through a loophole in the rules of the world, sort of magical time zones, so she doesn't experience the midnight where she's supposed to die, by a man named Jupiter North, who takes her to be a candidate to enter into the Wondrous Society. The Wondrous Society is a magical society based in a place called Nevermoor, which is where Jupiter North has brought Morrigan to, and Nevermoor is somehow secret and unknown to the part of the country that Morrigan comes from, and I'm assuming that this is some sort of world building that we're going to get more explanation of in future books, and I'm looking forward to it, because while there were a lot of things in the world building that did get explained over the course of this book, this is one of the mysteries that seems to be remaining for future volumes. But anyways, Morrigan is not supposed to be here. She's an illegal immigrant, and she has to face these trials which winnow down the pool of contestants to enter the Wondrous Society from some vast, vast number to some very, very small number. I'm not remembering my numbers, obviously. The odds seem completely stacked against her, but of course this wouldn't be a book if she didn't pass her trials, so you know she's gonna pass her trials. But the final trial is the one she is worried about, because in the final trial the candidates are supposed to display their magical talent, and Morrigan is pretty sure that she doesn't have one. Jupiter North has told her not to worry about the final trial. He will take care of the final trial, but she is still obviously and reasonably concerned. Along the way, she makes a good friend, and she's living in a cool magical hotel, and there's just a lot about this book that's really, really fun. It was a page turner. I kept just getting lost in it, and then coming up for air and realizing how much time had passed and what a huge chunk of the book I had just read, and you know, it's fun when that happens. This was a 4-star, really enjoyable middle grade read for me. Anyhow, as you can tell, I have completely lost my daylight. I have spent way too long filming, but I got it all done. Those were the rest of the books that I read in March. Anyhow, let me know if you've read any of these, or if you're planning to. Let me know what you think. I hope you're having a nice day. That is all. Bye for now.